And welcome into the roundtable. I'm Bill Priestley. Today we're going to talk about gamification, the puzzle that is maritime shipping. Do you go West Coast or do you go East Coast? How do you answer that question? Today we've got two experts to lend their experience to this question. We have Brian Glick, the founder and CEO of Chain.io, coming to us from Philadelphia, and James Coombs, the co-founder and CEO of Vector.ai, coming to us from London, England. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Let me start with you, Brian, actually both of you for this question. True or false, the migration of ships from West Coast to East Coast has been the greatest seismic shift in maritime shipping since perhaps, say, when American companies started overseeing their manufacturing going to Asia and forcing companies to come to the West Coast in that way. True or false?
I'm gonna go with a false. I think this is cyclical. I think we see it every 10 years or so where something bad happens and people do this and then they get lazy and they'll go right back as soon as things calm down.
Gotcha. James?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not gonna contradict Brian on that one. I mean, this is a super cycle, right? This entire industry is that, and participants will do what they have to find a capacity and find where they have to go.
Gotcha. So, Brian, let's talk about the decision just to decide which way to go. Obviously, we saw the pandemic and what it did to LA Long Beach in terms of all of that freight coming in, all of it getting backed up, and a lot of it started moving to the East Coast. What was really part of that decision-making process, other than just being practical? Is this something that's going to stay for a while? Is the cycle going to be longer in that effect, or is this going to be just a short blip and things should return to a quote-unquote normal as we saw pre-pandemic?
Oh.
Brian?
Is that to Brian or was that to me? Brian.
Go ahead. Actually, James, go ahead. We may have lost Brian for just a second.
So, Bill, if you just repeat the question quickly, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So basically, has the decision to move away from LA Long Beach, has that been sort of, is this a have to? Is it just because obviously things are going farther to the east? Is that more of, does that make this cycle longer, or do you think this could possibly be a little bit more permanent given what's going on in the East Coast ports now?
Yeah, look, I think forwarders are kind of having to be reactive to this kind of situation, right? So how are they looking at this kind of problem? So one, they clearly need to get closer to their shippers, right, to understand actually what their requirements are, what their inventory cover is, how do they need to how desperate are they, right? Like what kind of cover do they need? Two, they're absolutely looking at these kind of alternatives, but I think sometimes the ocean rates can be a bit misleading. It's way more than just some of these kind of ocean costs, right? It's all the other stuff. It's all the inland. It's all the kind of container yard and inland stuff. It's where's your DC. There's a lot of other factors that I think kind of get lost when you make these kind of decisions. And so I think it's definitely complicating that equation for both shippers and forwarders alike. And then three, how are they looking at it, right? They have to kind of take a portfolio approach. I think there is definitely an aspect of kind of forwarders looking at this and looking at the problems here and saying, look, in good times, we need to start diversifying kind of our East and West Coast kind of mix. And knowing that you have to do that to kind of pay a little bit of a premium for that, kind of construct that portfolio, and essentially have those relationships. So when stuff like this happens, you can react and you can have you really can have a presence on both, and you're not coming in cold when you have to make changes and kind of change ports like this.
Brian, Houston, Boston, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Miami have all made billions of dollars of improvements in terms of infrastructure over the last several years. It obviously has come at the right time for them in terms of seeing all these ships moving from LA Long Beach to the East Coast. What do you think about them playing more of a role? Does that play more of a role in shippers making decisions to go to the East Coast with all of these improvements that are coming on, taking advantage of what the pandemic has essentially given them?
I think it does. And I think the biggest change is the technology is available now for importers to make decisions that they couldn't make before. It was too hard on a spreadsheet 15 years ago to try to manage 6, 8 ports. With the TMSs and the visibility platforms, companies can make these risk-based decisions now, and they can start using those ports and understand that cheapest is not always best.
Gotcha. James, kind of along the same lines, what do you see as far as the advantages perhaps that these East Coast ports are getting by doing all of these improvements? Are they capitalizing and taking away what was in LA Long Beach's mind rightfully theirs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to Brian's point, it's a question of visibility. Obviously, the infrastructure is not quite there, right, on some of these kind of the smaller East Coast ports. So I think there's still some room to go. But I think really the answer lies in like freight forwarders and shippers kind of really building up that technology capability, building up that visibility capability, in order to make decisions about kind of which port to use and how it impacts kind of their supply chain using their tech, and then that will eventually benefit these ports, right? Because as the users end up getting more technologically proficient, then they can absolutely kind of pick and choose where they want to go. And I think that resilience factor is going to come up more and more, both at the shipper level and both at the forwarder, as well as at the forwarder level.
Right, dovetailing off of that, as you look at the plethora of choices that are available now to shippers, granted, obviously, where you want your cargo to go is going to be a great determining factor in what port you perhaps use. But beyond that, has the criteria changed for how where you want to send your goods into the U.S.?
I think it has. I think everyone always sort of knew if I put all my eggs in one basket, I'm taking a risk. And now I think we've seen the outcome of those decisions for a lot of companies and empty shelf space. And so I think the criteria now is a much more blended set of a balanced scorecard, instead of just saying, how do I make the CFO happy? What's the cheapest thing I can do within the time frame I have, which for most of my career has been the primary decision factor.
So let's look at some of those criteria, perhaps maybe that are now more important, other than just, like you said, pleasing the boss.
Well, I think one of them, probably the most important one, is, am I actually going to get my product on time, right? And is the plan going to be hit? And the thing we know right now, whether it's the blockages in Oakland, whether it's issues in Savannah, there are going to be more disruptions. We have lots of freight moving, unprecedented volumes, and so the question is, do I need to start thinking about diversification? And so if I know if I spread my bets, I'm less likely to get hit hard. I also know that there is now a visibility infrastructure to maintain that. So is the port a good participant in that infrastructure? You look at a port like Savannah that's doing really strong work, Jacksonville as well, to be a good participant in that process. So I would say that's a big factor as well, is whether the port is willing to be modern and significantly more modern than LA has been in the past.
James, I know you've talked about this at least a little bit earlier on in the interview, but what criteria would you use in advising a shipper in terms of where they should be sending their goods, other than obviously if they're sending them directly to a port where that's their end destination?
Yeah, it's that portfolio approach thing again, right? I think this is where forwarders come into their own, right? They become trusted advisors to the shipper, and they have to be in the room with a shipper. And one of those things that they clearly need to kind of work on and work with a shipper on is this portfolio approach, where I think we underestimate kind of the value of the relationships that are needed at kind of each area. And I think if you can kind of invest for the long term and have kind of a diversified approach where, maybe 90% of the time you're West Coast, 10% East, and you are kind of investing in that infrastructure. So that way you're not coming in cold when things like this happen again. And I would agree with Brian. Like, this isn't going to go away. I think we're going to get a lot more kind of union activity, inflation, which is kind of this kind of positive reinforcement loop, right, of inflation that is generated by supply chain, but that is then feeding into union kind of wage demands. I expect that to happen on both in Europe and the US.
Well, as we start to kind of wrap up this discussion, let's talk a little bit about the future in terms of where we see things going. Earlier this month, we heard a story about new inland ports moving up the Mississippi River into, say, Memphis or as far north as possibly Chicago, using the Chicago River. As shippers continue to kind of look at their options, how do you see these kinds of changes affecting them in the future there as well? James, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I mean, I had to figure out, I had to look the other day and realize how you get to Cleveland, right? There is definitely a place and a role to play for those kind of those ports that are a bit more inland, that have not had as much love, and also how that kind of fits into a strategy in terms of where your DC might be, right? So I think as we go forward, we will increasingly see kind of obviously the smaller ports get more activity. They will increase their infrastructure, and it will align with how shippers will look at this market, right? It'll align with that diversification approach. And as we go forward, look, every shipper will have to diversify. We're seeing that feed through into prices today because you're seeing that diversification element. You're seeing kind of more inventory cover, and as a result, there will be more of an imperative for shippers and forwarders to diversify, and that will only benefit some of the smaller ports.
Brian, let me wrap things up with you and throw you a rather futuristic idea. Obviously, we just talked about the Mississippi River becoming a future option, but is this a kind of an East Coast, West Coast turf war? And if so, what if we perhaps were to see a massive innovations come from Seattle-Tacoma or from Oakland, and they start to take away some of that East Coast business and put it back on the West Coast? Would you see that being as an option for shippers if that realization came to fruition?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is about the bottom line, and it's about, on-time delivery and cost. And nobody really has an emotional connection to LA or putting their freight in Savannah. If a port can deliver and they can make the numbers work, people are going to go there.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. This has been an interesting discussion, and certainly it's going to be a much more interesting issue to watch over the course of the coming decades as, again, innovation continues to come to all these ports, and we'll see exactly how shippers react to them as well. Thank you so much for joining us.